Hey everybody, so here we are starting our first lino cut of the semester, project 4. Um, I have my sketch here. So the concept is for your image to be a metaphor, and I can talk about the metaphor of this image a little bit either in class or later, but for now I want to kind of get into the technique side of things. So I did a sketch in my sketchbook. I made a pencil drawing, just like a cheap number 2 plastic pencil, or regular pencil works as well, onto tracing paper. So you might remember this from our colograph project where I transferred my drawing onto the colograph plate. I should be able to do the same thing for the lino block. My linoleum block, this is Battleship gray linoleum. Sometimes it's yellow or golden. They call it golden linoleum. Both are just fine. They cut on a similar fashion. This is just happens to be gray. This is mounted, which means that it's glued down to a block of particle board. Generally, it's a little bit more expensive than if it's unmounted. So unmounted would be just this material right here, just the linoleum, which has kind of a fabric backing to it. So you can see that glue starting to come undone. I generally don't pay for the mounted kind. I just use it unmounted, but this is just what they had when I went to the store. So as I mentioned before, tracing paper off of a roll tends to be kind of curly, like that is. Sometimes even if it's out of the pad, it'll want to do that a little bit. So just want to carefully, I had it taped down on top of my sketchbook. So I want to take my pencil, my graphite, and put that face down on the block. And I left a little bit extra, my tracing paper, so that I can tape this to my block, just on the back of it. I guess I could probably use a bigger piece of tape. Just reusing a piece of tape from when I taped down the wax paper for my colograph project. So here we go. So I've got a flap, where I can flip this out of the way if I don't need it, or I can flip it back. I want to use something really hard to transfer this with. So I could use another pencil. I've just found that I have to really bear down, whereas if I use a ballpoint pen, it's a different color, so I can see where I've transferred it a little bit better. I can kind of keep track of what areas I have transferred. And also, it's just, slightly harder point, so transfer is a little bit faster, I think. So, right, I'm going to flip you guys to time lapse and do my transfer real quick. Alright, you guys, so I've got my drawing transferred onto my block. One thing you might notice is that, graphite transferred onto the block. It also is really easy to transfer it onto something else other than the block, like your finger, and kind of get it to blur or smudge or whatnot. So I always have found it works much better if I go back with a Sharpie and kind of work into my drawing. And it also lets me see a little bit more like what the image is going to look like, because the Sharpie tends to be really graphic and black, as opposed to graphite being kind of gray and soft edge. The Sharpie has a harder edge. It's a mark making tool. It just gives me kind of a better sense of what my image is going to look like. And it also lets me maybe make some choices in the background. When I did my sketch, I had some sort of rays coming out of the raven's head. I might put those back in and go with that. But I can sort of Sharpie out areas. I think I want the bottom ground to be pretty solid black or mostly black. This I sort of scribbled on, so I'll have some maybe vertical lines cut into it, and then the sky or the background being even brighter. And what that'll do is that'll create, 4 different visual planes. I'll have the bird, the foreground that he's standing on, sort of a mid-space, and then a far background. And I can do that by how much material I cut away when I'm cutting my block. So I can kind of plan that with my Sharpie a little bit. And I'm going to put you guys in time lapse, and yeah, and finish sharpening it out the raven or the crow and his eye feathers and whatnot. Alright guys, so I got my lino block Sharpied. Just noticed that I missed one little spot. And the linoleum is gray all the way through its thickness. So when I cut at it, you can't tell generally where I've cut and where I haven't cut. And so to help with that, I'm going to create a little bit of cutting contrast. So I just have a little bit of acrylic paint. This is red. Kind of wondering if the Sharpie might bleed just a little bit since there was the graphite underneath it. So I'm not using a lot of pressure, just real gentle. And I'm just going to kind of dry it off real gently. And voila! I've got my what we call cutting contrast. So you can see where I already cut because those areas are lower. And I do want to make sure this is dry. So I'll give it a couple minutes to dry normally. But just for example right now, you can see where I've cut away already. So when I'm looking at it, I can see where I've cut, I can see where I haven't cut, and then the black tells me what to cut around. So just like a stamp, I want to remove all the negative areas, not the positive areas. So the areas that I want to print black or dark or whatever color I print is the areas I've drawn with the Sharpie. I want to cut the opposite. So I want to cut all the red areas from now on. And I can use any color acrylic that I want to do this cutting contrast. I've just found that red tends to show up a little bit better than some of the others. But that's it for cutting contrast, and then I will cut my block. Real quick about your tools. Most sets will come with some sort of U-gouge, and it's called a U-gouge because the shape of the tool is rounded like the letter U. And these are just my tools. They're a different brand than you guys are probably buying. Or you get a V-gouge, and it's called a V-gouge because it's shaped like a V. It's got a sharp edge. And each tool makes a different kind of mark. V-gouge marks tend to be, really sharp and kind of used for detail and fine line. U-gouges tend to be kind of for more open areas or softer marks. And that's something you're going to have to kind of experiment with while you're cutting. So I might use the V-gouge predominantly in the feathers and stuff inside my crow, but then I'll use the U-gouge in the background. And the reason for that is that kind of contrast between the type of marks I'm using will help sort of establish this being separate from the background. It's just a way to kind of use the visual language of the marks that your tools make to help distinguish, different objects or shapes or areas in space within your woodcut. So I'll probably use the U-gouge in the background, like I said, but in some areas maybe the V to get these real thin kind of red lines that I left here to help separate my border from my image area. So I am going to get my tools. I got my U-gouge, my small U-gouge, my small V-gouge, and I'll start cutting with the block in the time lapse.